January 24th, 1972. The jungles of Guam do not keep secrets quietly. They swallow them and wait for the right moment to spit them back out. Deep in the Talofofo River basin, two local shrimp fishermen, Jesus Dueñas and Manuel Garcia, were checking their bamboo traps. They were expecting nothing more than the day's catch of freshwater shrimp. Instead, they saw a ghost, a thin, weathered man with skin like parchment and eyes that seemed to belong to a different century, was crouching in the heavy undergrowth. He was clutching a handmade fishing net, his body covered in a patchwork of burlap and beaten hibiscus bark. When he saw the men, he didn't run, he lunged. Driven by a primal instinct for survival that had been sharpened over 28 years of isolation, he attacked. This was Shoichi Yokoi. He was a sergeant in the Imperial Japanese Army, and for him, the emperor's orders had never expired. The war had ended in 1945, but Yokoi had missed the memo, or rather, his training had taught him that the memo was a lie. This is a story about the silence after the storm. It is a story about what happens when loyalty becomes a prison, and when the human mind is forced to reconcile a lost cause with a world that has moved on without it. For the holdouts of the Japanese Empire, the jungle was not just a hiding place. It was a cathedral of duty. They had been raised on the Bushido Code, a philosophy where surrender was not just a failure of military tactics, it was a spiritual death. To return home in defeat was to bring shame upon your ancestors, your family, and your emperor. So, they stayed. They waited for a signal that would never come, fighting a war that existed only in the humid, green shadows of their own minds. Shoichi Yokoi's world was a cave. After the American forces reclaimed Guam in 1944, Yokoi and a small group of 10 soldiers retreated into the interior. They were not cowards. They were following the final orders of their superiors, to survive and harass the enemy until the main force returned. Within months, the group split up to avoid detection. Yokoi remained with 2 companions, but they lived in separate holes. In 1964, those 2 companions died, likely of starvation and disease, leaving Yokoi truly alone for his final 8 years. He lived in a hole he dug himself, 7 feet underground, hidden by a trap door disguised with grass and dirt. Inside, he had a small stove with a chimney hidden in the brush, a place to sleep, and a loom he had fashioned from scrap wood. He spent his days in total darkness to avoid detection by American patrols or locals, emerging only at night to forage for nuts, snails, and rats. He became a master of improvisation. He tailored his own clothes using the fibers of hibiscus bark, stitching them with needles made from wire. He made his own buttons from wood. When he was finally brought back to Japan, his first words to the public were, "It is with much embarrassment that I return." He apologized for not serving his emperor well enough. He looked at the neon lights of Tokyo and the skyscrapers of 1972 and felt like a man who had stepped off a spaceship. The Japan he loved was a memory, and the Japan he found was a stranger. But if Yokoi was a man of quiet endurance, then Hiroo Onoda was a man of active war. While Yokoi hid, Onoda hunted. In 1974, 2 years after Yokoi's discovery, the world was gripped by news from Lubang Island in the Philippines. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda had finally emerged. He didn't come out because he was tired, and he didn't come out because he was hungry. He came out because his former commanding officer, who had long since become a civilian bookseller, traveled across the ocean to tell him, officially, that he was relieved of duty. Onoda's 30-year war was a masterpiece of discipline and tragedy. He had been sent to Lubang in December 1944 with a specific set of orders. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, as long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. Under no circumstances are you to surrender your life voluntarily. Onoda took those words and turned them into a religion. He was an intelligence officer, trained in guerrilla warfare and sabotage. His mission was to destroy the Lubang airfield and the pier. He failed to do that because the American forces arrived too quickly, but he never failed in his commitment to the struggle. He was not alone at first. He had 3 soldiers with him: Policarpio Izuka, Shigeichi Shimada, and Kinshichi Kozuka. Together, they lived a life of constant tactical movement. They slept in makeshift camps, never staying in one place for more than a few days, to prevent the locals from tracking them. They raided local farms for cattle, which they slaughtered and dried into jerky to survive the rainy seasons. They burned piles of rice harvested by the villagers, believing they were destroying enemy supplies intended for American troops. To the locals on Lubang, they weren't heroes or legendary holdouts. They were a terrifying presence that had claimed the lives of 30 people over 3 decades in various skirmishes and accidental encounters. The psychological walls Onoda built were impenetrable. Over the years, the Japanese government and his own family dropped thousands of leaflets over the island. They dropped newspapers, photos from home, and letters from his siblings. Onoda and his men looked at these artifacts and reached a chilling conclusion. They were all clever American forgeries. When they saw a newspaper showing a modernized Japan, they thought the Americans had set up a puppet government and were trying to trick the last resistance into coming out. Even when they heard radio broadcasts about the Korean War or the Vietnam War, they convinced themselves that the Great East Asian War was still going on, but had simply shifted to different fronts. Every piece of evidence that the war was over was filtered through their suspicion and repurposed as proof that the enemy was getting desperate. One by one, Onoda's companions disappeared. Izuka walked away in 1950 and surrendered, realizing the war was likely over. Shimada was killed in a shootout with a Philippine search party in 1954. Finally, in 1972, the same year Yokoi was found on Guam, Onoda's last comrade, Kozuka, was shot by local police while they were burning rice. Onoda was now truly alone. For 2 more years, he navigated the jungle in total silence. He polished his Type 99 rifle every single day. He kept his 500 rounds of ammunition dry and organized. He kept his uniform repaired, using thread from his survival kit. He was a soldier without an army, a ghost in the trees, waiting for a command that had been forgotten by the rest of the world. The man who finally broke through the walls was not a general or a diplomat. It was a 24-year-old college dropout named Norio Suzuki. Suzuki was a nomad, a representative of the new Japan that Onoda couldn't understand. Suzuki told his friends he was going on a journey to find 3 things: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. In February 1974, Suzuki trekked into the Lubang jungle alone. He didn't carry a weapon. He carried a pack and a heart full of curiosity. He shouted Onoda's name into the canopy, calling him a hero of the empire. Miraculously, Onoda appeared. He stepped out of the brush, rifle aimed at the young man's chest. But instead of the American trickery he expected, he found a boy in a t-shirt and shorts who treated him with a strange, disarming respect. Suzuki stayed with Onoda for several days. They talked about the world, about the Japan that now made cars and electronics instead of war. Suzuki tried to explain that the war ended on August 15, 1945. Onoda listened, but his discipline was his spine. He told Suzuki, "I cannot surrender unless my superior officer orders me to do so." Suzuki took photos of the living legend and returned to Japan. The government moved with a speed it hadn't shown in decades. They tracked down Onoda's former commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. On March 9, 1974, in a small clearing in the jungle, the major put on his old military cap and read the surrender orders aloud. Onoda stood at attention, his posture perfect, his uniform clean despite 30 years in the jungle. He handed over his sword, his rifle, and his remaining ammunition. The war was finally over. When Onoda returned to Japan, he was greeted by a crowd of thousands. He was a national hero, a symbol of a lost era of grit and absolute loyalty. But the reality was more complicated. Onoda looked at 1974 Japan and saw a country that had become soft, obsessed with consumerism and Western values. He couldn't reconcile the sacrifice of his 30 years with the shallow prosperity he saw around him. He felt like a stranger in his own home. He eventually moved to Brazil to start a cattle ranch, seeking the silence he had grown used to in the jungle, before finally returning to Japan to open a nature school for children. He wanted to teach them the survival skills he had learned, but without the baggage of war. Then there was Teruo Nakamura, found later in 1974 on the island of Morotai in Indonesia. Nakamura's story is perhaps the most tragic because it was the quietest. He was a soldier of Taiwanese origin, serving in the Japanese Army. Because he wasn't ethnically Japanese, his return was not met with the same nationalistic fervor as Onoda's. He had lived in a small hut, growing sweet potatoes and eating bananas. He had been alone since 1956. When he was found by the Indonesian Air Force, he was terrified he would be executed. He had spent 30 years in a state of constant fear. When he returned to Taiwan, he found his wife had remarried, thinking he was dead, and his children were grown strangers. He died of lung cancer only 5 years after his rescue, never truly finding his place in the modern world. These stories ask a haunting question. What is the value of a life spent in service of a lie? History rarely pauses for such things. No battles were won by Yokoi's bark fiber clothes. No campaigns were turned by Onoda's 30-year patrol of a small Philippine island. And yet, for the men who sat in the dirt and felt the weight of their rifles, long after the world had forgotten them, the war was the only truth they had. They were the victims of a propaganda machine that taught them that their lives were less important than their obedience. They were the last echoes of a world that had burned itself down. Sometimes, the most tragic part of history is not what happens, but what is wasted. These men gave their youth, their sanity, and their futures to a ghost. When Yokoi returned, he said, "I am ashamed." When Onoda surrendered, he wept. They weren't weeping for the lost war. They were weeping for the realization that the world didn't need their sacrifice. They had been guarding a door that had been unlocked for decades. Their endurance was legendary, but their isolation was absolute. If you find these stories of human endurance and the weight of history worth remembering, consider subscribing so these moments aren't lost to time. Like the video to help it reach more people, and comment below. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Would you have believed the leaflets, or would you have stayed in the jungle, waiting for a major who would never come? There is a final detail that stays with those who study these men. Onoda's rifle, when he handed it over, was in perfect working condition. He had kept it clean and oiled for 30 years. He had 500 rounds of ammunition, and every single one was accounted for. This level of discipline, applied to a purposeless conflict, is the ultimate testament to the human capacity for commitment. But it is also a warning. These stories remind us that the enemy is often not the person on the other side of the trench, but the ideas we are told to die for. Authority becomes terror when it demands your entire existence. Survival, for these holdouts, was an act of incredible will, but it was also a tragedy of isolation. They proved that the human spirit can survive almost anything: hunger, disease, loneliness, and time. But they also proved that, without the truth, that survival is a hollow victory. After the cameras stopped flashing and the interviews ended, many of these men struggled to find peace. Yokoi became a television personality for a while, but he often spoke of his longing for the simplicity of his cave. He missed the certainty of his struggle. Onoda wrote a book called No Surrender, My 30-Year War, which became a bestseller. But he always carried a sense of grief for the comrades he lost on Lubang. They were men out of time, living reminders of a world that had rebuilt itself in a shape they didn't recognize. Sometimes, history is shaped by what does not happen. No punishment followed their surrender. No retaliation came from the people they had fought. There was only a quiet understanding that, even in the longest war, the end must eventually come. The sword was handed over, the rifle was laid down, and the ghost of the empire finally went to sleep. The jungle, once a battlefield, became just a forest again. Thank you for staying with me on this journey into the deep jungles of the past. These stories are a reminder that even when the world falls apart, we carry our duty with us. But we must be careful that our duty doesn't become our cage. Until next time, keep looking for the stories that were never meant to stay silent.